Right.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around our spinning globe in as much chaos as ever, unfortunately. But we have a guide of light to see us through the night and the fog, an old friend of this show, most eminent veteran correspondent. I think you are, John, the preeminent Western correspondent left in Moscow now. When I first covered the Soviet Union, as it then was, in 1986, all the major Western media, especially in the United States, sent their very best people to Moscow and to cover the Soviet Union. The competition was intense. The quality of coverage, the caliber of people doing the coverage was outstanding. And it remained so for many years. That is not the case today. Neither in the US government nor in the US media, incredibly, do they take having serious people of quality and experience and integrity on the ground in Moscow seriously. But we have one here tonight, the last survivor of a great tradition, John Helmer. And John, we are in such chaos, as you well know, in America, in Washington, in our domestic politics, and in the hideous mess we're in Iran and the Middle East and the Gulf. There is a widespread assumption among critics of the administration's policy that whether you love the Russians or loathe them, they have their act together. But they don't really or fully, do they? You have some very interesting, counterintuitive insights on this, backed by your wealth of experience and documentation. Explain to us.
Well, thank you for the excessively complimentary intro, Martin. Let's begin just with one wee footnote. There is no longer any quality of American journalists in Washington. Exactly. Never mind Moscow.
Agreed.
And if anyone listening doubts that, all they have to do is to look at the behavior of 2,000 of the country's best journalists sitting in a ballroom in Washington on Saturday, and not one of them can accurately report what happened when an alleged shooter discharged a firearm he is not visibly carrying in all the videos at a location where he was surrounded very quickly by at least eight security men, wrestled to the ground, and so on and so forth. Not a single significant journalist present seems to know what happened or notice what happened visibly, never mind the gunman, but on the stage where the Secret Service ushered the Vice President of the United States off more quickly than they got the President of the United States off the stage. What a debacle, not simply for the President and Vice President, but for American journalism in general. So leaving a really important measuring stick to be Washington, what do we have in response to your question in Moscow? Well, we can readily understand what's happening in Moscow because it's very well reported. It's well reported. To be sure, it's not reported in the state media as well as it is in the social media, the military bloggers, and very large number of websites. Not necessarily those offshore now in Latvia, Germany, and other places, which are anti-regime. What we have, let's say, to start with, is a recession, an economic recession, initially identified as the recession the central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, predicted last October in the central bank's projections of various scenarios for the future. Nabiullina projected that the Russian economy might go into -2%, -3% GDP recession for 2026 and 2027. That wasn't paid any attention to at the time. And it was modified and qualified by her argument that that might not happen. Well, it is happening, and it's worse than the macroeconomic statistic for January, February, minus 1.8%. It's much worse in the regions. Now, all Russians know this to be true. So when the president of the Federation, Vladimir Putin, announces at a meeting of his economic advisors a week ago that this is the case, minus 1.8%, but he has understood from experts that this is caused by weather conditions. What do we have? The president of Russia is telling Russian people facing all forms of recessionary impact that it's caused by the weather. You don't tell Russians in January and February, let alone as the spring comes on in April, that their troubles are caused by the weather. No one believes that. Instead, you do serious damage to yourself for having said so. And yet, we can understand that President Putin does not understand the damage he's just done to himself when he said that last week. That's on a fundamental that all voters understand around the world. There's recession, there are troubles, there are unpaid wages, there are all forms of constriction of economic welfare. And for the president to say it's caused by the weather discredits the president. That's on economic policy. What we have then is a couple of important examples I'd like to mention. One is that the Ukrainians have stepped up with US help, with British help, with French help, a level of drone attack aimed at Russian energy infrastructure. And they have effectively struck the Tuapse oil refinery with significant damage. This time cannot be described as a pinprick damage to refineries of the kind that have occurred all around the western part of the country. What I can tell you is that what's obvious from the mainstream media reporting of the Tuapse refinery fire and the social media coverage, you have a very significant fire that's burned for several days now. At the climax of a series of drone attacks that have gone on since about April 16 for at least 10 days, reaching a climax in which you not only have a fire, but you have significant acid rain and oil deposits as a result of the weather conditions dropping the oil fire debris onto the ground, affecting individual health, affecting livestock, pets, and all forms of environmental survival have been affected. The governor of the region has declared a state of emergency for Tuapse. Now, it's all obvious to everyone. And yet, here's what the president said a day or two ago. Quotes there, and I'm reading, pardon me for looking down. There are threats, they are growing. Increasingly, drone strikes on civilian infrastructure being carried out. Here is the last example. Blows to energy facilities in Tuapse, which could potentially cause serious environmental consequences. However, the governor just reported he's on the spot. Well, at least a couple of hours ago, said Putin. There are no serious threats. People are coping on the spot with the challenges they face. That's more or less true, but it's not what you expect the president of the Federation to be saying. In the first place, it's generated a wave of jokes, ironies, and direct, explicit criticism for Putin to say, if that's what you think, you're mistaken. The extent of the damage without giving anything away to the enemy is so obvious, you don't say such things. You simply don't say it that way. Second, what's wrong with the president that he sits either in St. Petersburg, as he was on Monday to receive the foreign minister of Iran, or in Moscow? Can't he go to Tuapse and check what's happening? That's what people on the spot would like to see, especially a president who's at the beginning of an election campaign, which will result in national elections on or about September 25, 26, in which the current polling shows that if you combine the votes predicted for each and all of the opposition parties, including the Communist Party, they will win a majority for the first time against the government's ruling party, United Russia. Now, what do these two episodes amount to? And I'm not repeating the kind of, let's say, negative drum beating of opposition to Putin, regime change support that you get in Kiev, you get in London, you get in Washington, and so forth. I'm not doing that. What I am saying is speaking from a Russian point of view, how Russian people respond to this. What does it remind them of? I tell you what it reminds them of. Kursk, not 2000. Kursk, August 2000. What happened then? The Kursk submarine sank suddenly in the north, in waters north of St. Petersburg. It was a disaster. The causes appear to have been accidental discharge, an explosion of dummy torpedoes about to be fired. The submarine sank to the seabed. It took many days before the fate of the crew, all dead, was fully revealed and disclosed. The accident happened. I'm calling it accident. At the time, the Russian Navy described as the result of a collision with a NATO vessel. I don't believe it. I was reporting at the time. I didn't believe it at the time, but reported it at the time. That's not my point now. I don't mean to rehash what happened. Those who want to know exactly what happened can start with the Wikipedia version, and it gives you a fair summary of what happened. But starting on the 12th of August, a national disaster occurred that in the Russian Navy. But Putin was depicted as making barbecues and enjoying his summer holiday on the 12th of August, a summer month for most Russians. What he showed then for the next 10 days was a reluctance to engage directly. It wasn't until the 22nd of August, 10 days later, that Putin, the new president of Russia, with a great deal of popular goodwill directed at him in his replacement of Boris Yeltsin, deeply unpopular, untrusted, and regarded by the Russian people as best to be rid of. Putin had great goodwill, but didn't go for 10 days. Now, is Putin now suffering? Let's call it the Kursk 2000 syndrome. What does it mean? Here's where I'll add a few analytical points. I've said enough to point out that Russian people are bemused, puzzled, shocked even by the refusal of the president addressing two very obvious events. One, recession. Two, the Tuapse refinery, a regional matter. There's a third issue, and that affects the better educated, more well-off groups in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and that's the attempts to control and shut down parts of the internet in Russia, allegedly, says Putin, for security reasons. That's not treated as truthful any longer. And in fact, the government is having to retreat on the issue of internet security. There is a security problem. Ukrainian drone attacks do depend to a large extent for guidance and targeting on the use of mobile telephone, mobile computer devices, and security shutdowns of a temporary kind are commonplace when attacks are underway. But this isn't a temporary attack. This is a systematic reduction, and it's generated a, let's call it, upper middle class reaction, especially against among the young. And again, Putin is under immense public criticism, open criticism. I'm not saying anything new here. And he doesn't seem to know how to respond. And he doesn't want to connect with his critics. What does that mean? Well, in the past, I've tried to explain that President Putin has unusual skills, which you all have seen. They're the skills of a mnemonist. He has extraordinary memory, and thus he can sustain 4 or 5 hours of public discussion, question and answer, with a recital of streams of information he memorizes. And he goes into extensive preparation for these memory sessions. The mind of a mnemonist, of a specialist in memory, of photographic memory, eidetic memory, is not necessarily the mind of a strategist who can anticipate moves ahead. It's not necessarily the skill of a politician who can accommodate criticism, multiple forces arguing different points of view. What happens with a mind of Putin's quality is cognitive overload. He cannot cope. His great skill leaves him at a disadvantage in coping with surprise information. That may sound odd to people. I believe it to be so. When he faces surprise information, he retreats into silence, into isolation. He retreats to where he's cognitively comfortable. And politically, that looks as if he's in retreat, he's running away. It's a political liability when you're trying to start a national parliamentary campaign. So I hope this helps answer first your main question here, Martin. There are problems. You don't need the Telegraph of London to exaggerate them, or the Murdoch press to exaggerate them, from the Times to the Wall Street Journal to the New York Post. You don't need that sort of exaggeration, that inimical enemy intent. This is not a propaganda show. What I'm trying to say is, what I'm saying is absolute commonplace among Russian people. The problem we have is we go into an election campaign is the president is not coping as he usually does with the obvious to everyone. And as a result, his polls are beginning to show it. The level of approval of his performance is beginning to sink, and it's doing that steadily. Yes, only 1 percentage point, 1 or 2 pp a month, but it's significant in its trend, and it's more significant in its meaning. How's that for starters?
A frightening first course, and so much to follow up with from it. Do you think Putin can come back from this? Does he have a track record of doing it? Because he did come back after Kursk. And like you say, he doesn't do it quickly. He seems to be a man for the long run rather than the short sprints. Is that a reasonable assessment?
Easier to speak of an answer issue by issue, and what's happening issue by issue,
yes,
is different. For example, I've argued in print and in other podcasts, so not to overstrain everyone's patience by repeating myself. Podcast journalism isn't an opportunity to repeat oneself. That's for a Hyde Park soapbox, not me, not you, not Pelle. On Iran, on the Iran war, Putin's line is one thing, the military line another thing. The military plus intelligence services plus the foreign ministry have a different approach to how to deter the US from resuming the kind of war that President Trump wants with his particular Washington allies and Israeli allies to wage against Iran. And let's not forget, Trump has just issued a tweet with himself holding a submachine gun. Headline, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." I'm looking to my right to see this absurd display of personal violence. Putin has a line with his advisors, including the governor, the central bank governor, Nabiullina, of pacifying, ingratiating, appeasing Trump. That is not the line that the military, the intelligence service, and the foreign ministry have adopted. And for the time being, I think it would be fair to say, in answer to your question, he has delegated to the others to run the Russian assistance for Iran to defend and deter the Americans. That's not quite so clear on the Ukraine war settlement, which in any event is in suspension. There are no negotiations now, but Putin continues to vest his trust in Kirill Dmitriev, a representative of the Russian oligarchy, which continues to exercise very substantial power over presidential policymaking. Dmitriev ignores the Iran war, ignores the Gaza genocide, ignores everything but appeasing Trump, which he does daily in his tweets, and attacking the Europeans. That's his line as he prepares to boost himself daily on the capacity he thinks he has, to negotiate terms of settlement with the United States. So far, he's failed dismally on every point. That would recommend to Putin that he send Elvira Nabiullina as the new Russian director of the IMF to Washington and put her safely out of the way of the Russian economy, especially this year in the election, and remove her from the central bank and change the policies in line with what just about every economist in the Russian parliament recommends. President could send Dmitriev to Dubai and Saudi Arabia and let him focus on building investment relations with those two under fire from Iran and see if he can raise any money from them. He hasn't been able to raise a single penny from the Americans. But either way, the answer to your question, Martin, has to be different from Iran than it is currently from the Ukraine. Can he recover by getting rid of Nabiullina, getting rid of Dmitriev? Can he recover political trust? I believe he could. And he has the capacity to change under pressure, not necessarily because he's been persuaded cognitively or analytically or strategically, but because he has to save himself.
Question. John, do you think, so you're saying that in your blogs, you talk about the two factions, the hardliners, for lack of a better word, who are able to run the show in Iran, headed by the head of intelligence, Koschetkov or something. And then you've got the softer line prevailing on Ukraine with Putin's and Dmitriev. Do you think, what do you think, or what do Russians think? You can give both if they differ. Is Trump actually supportive on Ukraine? And that's why I supported him. I thought, well, here's a man who realizes the importance of negotiation. Or is he quietly strangling the Russians with economic sanctions while officially tweeting nice things about the Russians, and apparently even invited Putin along to the G8 meeting. So he's giving all this fluffy propaganda stuff, but in fact, he's aligned with the Brits and the French in basically trying to kill Russia, but economically without overt military escalation.
Let me unpack a number of things you said, Pelle. Let's start with, I don't think it's fair or accurate to describe one line as hard and the other one as soft. The military intelligence foreign ministry line you could describe as national or nationalist. You could describe them as defending Russian state interests. The soft you could describe as pro-American and ready to sell out from the Russian point of view, the national interest, much as the Yeltsin administration did for 10 years between 1991 and the year 2000. So hard and soft, hawk and dove, not appropriate labels. So leaving aside the categorizations, I'm not so sure how you would rephrase the question. Would you mind rephrasing?
Okay, well, what is Trump really trying to do in Ukraine versus Russia? And what do you think he's really trying to do? And what do Russians think he's really trying to do?
Okay, let's go to the second question, because I'm not a psychopathologist on the question of what Trump's really trying to do is distinct from what the United States and the people around him are trying to do and so forth. Let's leave that aside for the minute. What Russians think differs. On the one hand, there's no doubt, and you were right to surface it, at the beginning of the administration, the Russian public opinion was positive towards Trump. Kremlin policymakers and the intelligence services and the foreign ministry were all positive because the Biden administration, the Democrats, were so hostile. So from a consensus point of view, and I believe it was a consensus back before, in the weeks leading up to the November 2024 election, and then in the weeks that began the administration, there was great optimism on the part of the Russian consensus, both popular voter and policymaker, that Trump presented an opportunity that should be exploited. Trump promised to end the war. Trump promised to negotiate. Let's say there were opportunities there on the surface, explicitly expressed, that had been denied, rejected, repudiated by the Democrats and by the Biden administration. That opportunity reflected itself on all fronts, but has been systematically destroyed by Trump's behavior. And not simply Trump. I mean, let's say we started with the Riyadh meetings, which involved Michael Waltz, Marco Rubio, and I'm trying to remember who else was there on the US side. On the Russian side, you had the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. You had the presidential advisor, matching Waltz, which is Yuri Ushakov. Dmitriev tried to sit at the table and was excluded from the room. From then on, you've had a systematic failure of the US side to do anything, literally anything, to improve, even at the level of the operation of the State Department embassies and consulates in Russia and the Russian embassies and consulates in the United States. Even in the past few days, the United States has refused visas to Russian officials heading to UN conferences and G20 preparation conferences. Refuse visas without reason. Now, as I understand it, Trump has invited President Putin to attend the G20, not the G8, the G20, because the US has presidency of that body, and I believe the summit meeting capping the US presidency will be in Miami. Let's call it Trump's second hometown in December. Putin has not said no. He hasn't said yes. December is a long way off. But if you look at the goodwill on the United States part, you can't even get a Russian Sherpa into preparation for this ceremony. So what meaning does it have to invite Putin and then deny one of the minor Sherpas a visa to come attend the prep meetings? So that's simply, in the last few days, an example that nothing the Trump administration has promised or Trump himself has promised has come to fruition. Another more serious issue would be the steady escalation of U.S. Trump-induced, Scott Bessent implemented sanctions on anyone buying and selling, trading Russian oil. Now, Trump gave an exception initially to the Chinese after introducing the ban, the secondary sanction on Rosneft and Lukoil sales of oil. And then, because of the Hormuz Strait closure and global supply problems, he gave an exception to Russian oil afloat so that the Indians began to buy it up. But when the issue became, will the month-long extension of the Russian waiver came up for negotiation between Bessent, Dmitriev, Witkoff, and Kushner early in April, early this month, Bessent was very clear and explicit: no to Russia. Bessent is consistently no to Russia, consistently hostile to both Russia and China. And Trump intends to go to Beijing and give President Xi Jinping a big hug. That's Trump's version of it, tweeted and personal. Big hugs for the Chinese while punishing them. Well, how can one assume a positive attitude to such behavior? Not only, and I've just mentioned China, but I hope I've answered your question, Pelle. Yeah. The behavior of Trump has, in fact, discredited himself in public opinion in Russia. Russians understand and are far more sympathetic to Palestine and to the Gazan debacle, the Gazan genocide. The Russians are far more supportive of the Palestinians than President Putin himself is. And Trump's behavior on Gaza, Trump's behavior in launching the war against Iran are deeply unpopular in Russia, and that's expressed in the press. So the result is that Trump has no longer any credibility in Russia except for a small circle and the Russian oligarchs around the Kremlin who continue to believe you can bribe and induce the Trump circle, Trump himself, his son-in-law Kushner, his particular close associates like Witkoff, Lutnick, and others, into making the kinds of concessions that the Russian side wants, which are business as usual, whatever the cost and whoever should pay for it.
Okay, I've got one more question then. We had King Charles. I mean, I wrote a book about World War One. King Charles, his great grandfather, King Edward, played a huge role in starting World War One. I mean, basically, the iron ring that they struck around Germany was manufactured by the British and their diplomacy. So we can't underestimate the power of kings. Yesterday, he gave a speech to Congress where he said, after 2001 September 11 attacks, we answered the call together as our people have done so for more than a century, shoulder to shoulder through 2 world wars, the Cold War, Afghanistan, and moments that have defined our shared security today. Mr. Speaker, that same unyielding resolve is needed for the defense of Ukraine and her most courageous people. How do you read that? Do you read that as a call for joint escalation between from the British and the Americans, and do you think such an escalation will be coming?
Look, Charles was an amiable, witty boy when he went to school in Australia. He had an extremely dim-witted first wife, and his current wife is clearly mentally superior to the first one, but I don't take them seriously as policymakers. That line is clearly dictated by Prime Minister Starmer, who's as popular in domestic British opinion as you know it to be. I think that he's simply another head of state echoing what the government of the day tells him to say. The British line on fighting Russia forever is a very old one. It's a very old one. And the particular problems that the British face in maintaining Trump's commitment to that line go up and down. I don't think we need to talk about it too much. From a Russian point of view, perfidious Albion has been utterly consistent. Utterly consistent. Correct me if I've misread. Any point in time, even Jeremy Corbyn has been hardly, and he's long gone, and that wing of the Labour Party, or that line in the Labour Party, long defeated, suppressed, and silenced, was hardly resistant to the long-standing traditional British permanent war against Russia. And I don't see that the King of Britain has said anything new in Congress. What the political reason for his saying it, you know better than me. He's trying to make sure that the doubters of Trump's basic war-making line against Russia will not lead to any damage to the NATO alliance and to the commitment to European rearmament as well as British rearmament. But the British have got another problem. And I think the King of England, of Britain, has got to mobilize the Americans to not overdo it so that the German rearmament becomes as big a threat to the future of Great Britain as it once was.
John, our 40-minute time is up. Thank you so much. I mean, what you're giving is a startlingly, amazingly clear exposition of the situation as it really is, and as well as what the Russians really think. And you've cut through all the verbiage, both on the podcasts and the alternative media sphere. Most people don't speak Russian, and told us exactly what's going on. So I'd love to have you on again shortly, and we'll wind up there. So thank you so much, sir. And thank you, Martin. And see you tomorrow for further guests and further analysis. Thank you.
Thank you,
John.
Thank you, Martin.
All right.
Sean,
Thanks for sharing.
again, a pleasure and an education.
Take care.
Absolutely, like Pelle said.